Our next speaker, Nils Gerhardt, is the Chief Technical Officer for Utimaco, a leading provider of cybersecurity solutions, a board member of the IoT M2M conference. Before joining Utimaco, Nils worked at G&D in Germany, United States, and Canada. Please give a warm welcome to Nils Gerhardt. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? The microphones are working? Very good. So good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be on this special stage, to actually be able to walk around and look into the audience. And I'm very happy to share my thoughts on compliance and regulatory topics with you. My name is Nils Gerhard. I'm the CTO of Utimaco. And Utimaco is a company, just to put this in perspective, that is a leader in cybersecurity. We have offices around the world. We're about 500 employees with about 100 million in turnover. And we have recently been selected by ABI Research to be the top implementer and also the top company in our field of business. But to best start with the presentation and to explain what Utimaco is doing and how compliance and regulatory topics play a role, I like to use this picture. This picture is a picture of a smart city. This city could be any place in the world because there's a lot of initiatives to modernize, to digitalize, to bring fast communication into smart cities, to actually connect critical infrastructure in the right way, to provide services to citizens, to have self-driving vehicles, to have industrial automation topics covered. A lot of things that actually make a city smarter and eventually also to reduce the environmental footprint and to make the life more easy and automated. So there's one thing that is in common from a security perspective, and that is that all these digitalization cases need a root of trust, something that the trust of a digital service can be built upon. And this is what Utimaco is providing. So you probably all know that we handle more and more sensitive data on a daily basis because we keep that in secure storage. We actually work in a remote and distributed way and fashion, using home office, using laptops, using different mobile devices, all sorts of different channels which we use to access the systems and access confidential and sensitive data. We store data in the cloud. We try to encrypt it. We try to protect it in the appropriate way. And we're relying on a small number of people. Look around you. You probably see a lot of them in the audience here today that are protecting this infrastructure, our data, for the government, for the industry, but also for you individually as citizens, as people. And this is something that is very important from a regulatory perspective to make sure that the security is provided, that we are compliant, that we give a framework to the industry, to the government on how to digitalize and how to keep the society secure. But there's a second aspect here, and this is very close to my heart. I am a technology person, but at the same time, I also like the innovation aspect of things. And this actually fuels technology and the other way around. And this is where regulations can help to open up markets, open up opportunities. We have seen this with the data protection laws that are evolving around the world in different places. We also saw this with open banking. Open banking is spreading, more and more countries giving new players in the fields access to the data that is in the core system of the banks, for instance, to innovate, to build new business models on top of it. And this is the beauty. And the question is, what comes next? What is the next regulation that makes a difference in the ecosystem, in the field, where how we innovate and how we build services for tomorrow? And that could be, for instance, but it's only really an example, a EU Data Act, which discusses who owns the data, who can monetize the data. How can you actually make use of this 80% of data that you have today that is collected but never used? How you can make use of that data by a government organization or by the industry, as well as to give a benefit back to the person that actually owns the data, that is actually helping collect the data in a, for instance, smart car that is connected all the time. So how that actually relates to compliance and to regulations, there are actually four categories here that we primarily see. It's on one hand digitalization and transformation. You see that Saudi has an agenda for 2030 and to build actually controls and also to innovate in the field of digitalization. There is the same or a similar project in the UAE. You see also similar initiatives in the EU, like EIDAS, for instance, where every citizen is supposed to get an identity that you can use across different countries, kind of a federated identity where you can use services across countries in an authorized and an authenticated way. The second thing is data access and data sharing. So how do you deal with the situation of transparency on one hand, and then the ownership of the data and the possibility to move data from one institution to the next and make sure the data is staying and remaining secure. And then on the other side, it's digital payments. We see a lot of transactions, a lot of value in that industry, and that needs to be regulated. You see person-to-person payments, you see digital payments happening, you see card transactions at a record level after the Corona times. And this is where you also need a very strong governance on the regulatory side, provided, for instance, in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by SAMA. There's another aspect, the fourth one here, and that's the data protection. And the data protection of personal identifiable data has really gone around the world. And most countries today actually have, in one way or the other, the protection of data in their agendas. If you look at the US alone, they have about 160 consumer privacy-related bills in the different states. I mean, this is just a massive number, but you see this in all other countries as well around the world, that the protection of the personal identifiable data is becoming more and more important. Now, if you look at that from a statistical perspective and in numbers, you see that in 2021, you had about 70%, a little bit more than 70% of the countries around the world that had one way or the other way to protect the personal data of the citizens. And 10% of the countries that were in the progress of putting a law in place. There were only 15% of countries that didn't have anything at that time to protect the data of the citizens. So now this brings us to the fundamental balance that I think needs to be achieved between transparency of the data, the protection of the data, and then also the aspect of the ownership, which really hasn't been so much at the forefront in the past. And that needs the protection at the very root of your installation, of the use case that you're setting up, so that you can flexibly deal with the data later on in compliance with the regulations that are in place. Now let's go a little bit deeper and look into some examples here from different industries. Let's start off with the example of automotive. You see about 1.5 billion cars driving around on Earth today, and you add about 70 to 90 million each year to it. And they're becoming more and more smarter. You might have 100 or 150 so-called ECUs, little computing units that orchestrate all the traffic in the car that's connecting to the outside on the application side. You have the communication with the car. So if you look at it from a cockpit perspective, there's only very little you as a person, as a driver, see in a car. You see what the user interface is, but there's a lot of things happening in the back. There's the communication in the car itself. So if a sensor says, oh, you're very close to a specific target, better brake. These decisions take place within the vehicle itself. You have a communication layer. You might have a Wi-Fi hotspot. You might be connected to the infrastructure or communicating some data in the future to other cars. Or you have an application layer. So somewhere in the back, the data is collected. There may be an update provided to the car so that a functionality or bug that you might have in the system is corrected over the time. All these aspects need to be secure. And this is a very complex ecosystem. So how do you do that? And so it's very interesting to look at some of the more recent developments in terms of regulatory progress. like the UNECE 29, this is something where you see more or less a global standard that, that focus on the safety, on cybersecurity, and related to that as well, some of the ISO standards that in some aspects are a little bit more inclusive of the countries they are covering and where it's adapted in terms of providing the safety and the security management as well as the management of the updates to the car itself. So this is a very complex ecosystem that needs more and more regulations at the very core to do and to support the digitalization in the car in a secure way. The second aspect is digital government. So if you look at the government maturity level, it's great to see that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia actually is one of the leaders when it comes to providing digital services. I was able to experience some of that myself when I applied for the visa to enter Saudi Arabia, on how you can use government services in a more easy way. How do you communicate and how you provide your data. And this is something that really is going even to progress faster than what we see today. Because you have 4 areas that you cover as a government usually. It's the communication from a government to a government. It's the communication from a government to a business or government to a citizen that uses the service. And also, of course, to the employees. And there are 2 aspects that need your attention from a security perspective. It's the internal processes, how you operate everything within your systems in a secure way, and the external aspects as well. So you have a lot of different players that you interact with as a government, be it the citizen or the business or other governments, and you need an appropriate level of protection in each of that. And you see here, it's just a selective number. There's of course more out there in terms of standards that play a role, whether it's the Network and Information Systems Directive or the Essential Cybersecurity Controls in Saudi Arabia or the FISMA in the US. There are different standards here how to protect your infrastructure from the very core when it comes to digitalization in the government field. And then finally, I skipped the slide because it's a little bit repetitive to this one, it's the topic of financial transactions. You see here some really impressive numbers. You have topics like tap-to-pay transactions, so where you actually pay contactless. You have topics like peer-to-peer payments that have digitalized even more. And today, it's a click of the button. It's less than 10 seconds, I know it myself, to transfer money from one country to the other. And this is some field where, in parallel to topics, of course, like peer-to-peer payments, where you know platforms like PayPal and others, is really a field which is going to grow even further because businesses and consumers are interacting much more across borders. There are no borders really anymore. And so this is something that, that will increase even further. And the value in the transactions is just really huge. So you need the right level of governance to make sure that you pick from the different standards out there the right protection, be it from a NIST perspective or from a SAMA perspective, the different right ingredients to build your security for the ecosystem. Let me give you one example where this shows. You have the PCI standard that is governing a lot of the transactions out there that you have today, be it for the manufacturers on one hand, or for the processors or the application providers on the other hand. You have a standard and a certification in place that to become compliant and to play in the field of banking and financial transactions. And there's an interesting example. So they were using the DES as a technology in the past in a specific mode, and the security was weakened, and at the same time it was also not defined how you used keys and what you were using that for. So now this is something that strategically, and as early as 2019, was changed. But because the ecosystem is so complex and was not necessarily built for some agility on how we actually integrate and use new cryptography in ways that, our society needs. This is something where they envisioned the key block format to increase security, and it takes more than 4 years to roll this out to the whole ecosystem in its entirety. And this is just a small change. And if you look at that, and what it leaves us with is, we need to think about the agility of cryptography, of our systems, to make sure that in the future, it's easier for us to adapt to new standards if the security of our systems are broken or weakened, particularly also in the context of new potential threats like quantum computers coming into the play. So this leaves me with a brief summary of what we are doing as a company. We are providing the security and components to build the trust to be compliant with legislation, regulations, and industry best practice, be it on the PKI side or hardware security module side or encrypting data that's going to the cloud. This is actually our core business with all the necessary certifications in place that could help your business, that can help governments to be compliant and also protect you individually as citizens. That brings me to the question and the answers. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening.
Any questions? Okay, we're kind of behind schedules. Oh, this is one question? Did we have a question? We have one question. Let's take one question and we'll move on because I know we started late. Let's get the microphone.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I've got one challenge. I'm just looking that if you can give some tips that now regulations are so many. Like if you take the financial sector, comply with the three financial from SAMA, that is cybersecurity, IT framework, and BCM, is essential cybersecurity, critical system, then cloud cybersecurity, telework, and social media. 8, 9 is PCI, 10 is data protection. If you have got ISO, it will be ISO 27001, 11, ISO 22301, 12, and maybe ISO 20013. So we have got 13 certification or 13 compliance on the plate. So what will be your tip to address all of these aggressive challenges? Thank you.
So I will probably not be able to provide you a solution today, but I can give you my thoughts on it. So first of all, I believe that when you build security from scratch into the systems, it will be easier to comply with the different regulations. That's the first thing. That's something that potentially you can also influence on your company side. On the other end, I think that what we will see more and more going forward is that certain regulations and specifications will accept, kind of that the other certification is already in place and take it as a kind of an input and kind of accept it as a certification, as a reciprocal way. So what I mean by that is if you, for instance, comply with PCI, then you may not actually comply with some others because they accept that the security level is equivalent. I think we will see more and more of that. If you look at the automotive side, for instance, if you look at the ISO 26262 and then the UN ECE WP29, there's already this kind of concept starting to evolve. And I would hope that this happens in the payment space as well, so you don't have to comply to all sorts of different standards. But these standards take into account that you've already, because of complying with another standard, set appropriate level of security and compliance.
Great. Thank you. Warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nils. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Build security from scratch. I like it. Thank you.